Welcome to another session of Church Chat. Before we start on our Bible study of Philippians, I want to shout out to the Chiefs, wish them well for Sunday to repeat as Super Bowl champions. Just out of curiosity, I went back and looked at past records from each year back to the beginning of the franchise, and there were some really lean years, some years where the Chiefs weren't up to much and had losing records, and so it is exciting that for 2 years in a row they are playing for the Super Bowl. So go Chiefs! Now back to Philippians. As I read through this during the week, I was reminded why this is one of my favorite, if not my very favorite, book in the New Testament. There's just so much good stuff in here, and it was interesting for me that Paul is writing from prison. He describes himself as in chains. And there's just a couple of lines that I'd like to lift up as a reflection on the first couple chapters. There's a lot of good stuff, and I hope that you read through it or that you will read through it after viewing the recording. In chapter 1, verse 27, it seems trendy to get tattoos on your arms or wherever. And I think if I was ever going to get a tattoo, which I won't, I might have verse 27 tattooed. And it reads, "Whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ." And if things are going well, that might be easy, but Paul is in prison and in chains. And so he might be discouraged, he might be unhappy, but his admonition is, whatever happens, good, bad, indifferent, conduct yourself worthy of the gospel of Christ. And that is like a daily challenge, a daily message for me and for probably all of us, is that whatever we face, we're trying to live for the gospel of Christ. And so I'll just read that verse again and the several following, and then one more little comment on shining like stars. So verse 27, "Whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Then, whether I come and see you or only hear about you in my absence, I will know that you stand firm in one spirit, contending as one man for the faith of the gospel, without being frightened in any way by those who oppose you. This is a sign to them that they will be destroyed, but you will be saved, and that by God. For it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ, not only to believe on him, but also to suffer for him, since you are going through the same struggle you saw I had, and now hear that I still have." So, even though he's struggling, he's still living for Christ, whatever comes along. And in this time when there's so much fear, we find our strength in our unity and in God's Spirit. And then just to the end of my bit, over into chapter 2, it talks about shining as stars, and I won't read that passage, but it occurred to me as I was reading how much of our culture today is about getting fame, about getting our own way, about being rebellious, about being shocking. And Paul recommends and encourages just the opposite, that we are to live as examples of Christ. And part of that is being righteous and holy, sinless. Part of that is cooperating and working with others. And so his message is so different than our culture today. And I think our society would be improved if all of us could shine like stars and live with sinlessness and blamelessness and purity rather than all the rebelliousness and shocking behavior that is promoted. So I'm sure that Randy and Lynn have some to share with us, and I will hand it over to them.
I just said to Sid, it's funny how often we choose the same verses and unlike the same things, but I guess that's pretty obvious. Those are the main ones. Philippians is one of my favorite books. In fact, when I bought this new Bible that I'm contending with, I bought a new set of labels so that I could find things quickly. And there was a label in there labeled life verse. And that may be a Baptist thing or something. I didn't quite know what a life verse was, but I right away in my other Bible went to Philippians and stuck that on there so it blocks other things because it doesn't match. But Philippians is one of my favorites too. And I wanted to read it in a different version, so I grabbed the Message, and the introduction to Philippians I thought was really neat. It says, "This is Paul's happiest letter, and the happiness is infectious. Before we've read a dozen lines, we begin to feel the joy ourselves. The dance of words and the exclamations of delight have a way of getting inside of us." Maybe that's why I like Philippians so much, because it is encouraging. And as Sid said, Paul was in one of his, he had many of them, but he was in one of his bad predicaments, and it just didn't get him down. And he ended up being a testimony to other people just by his behavior and converting the soldiers and all number of things. So we are in a gloomy point in the world's history, really, with so much of the world ill and confined and gloomy. I think Philippians is something that kind of speaks to that, our approach to our surroundings and our circumstances. Paul's circumstances were really troubling, and he just didn't let him get it down. So it says, I liked this last paragraph, but circumstances are incidental compared to the life of Jesus the Messiah that Paul experiences from the inside in prison. For it is a life that not only happened at a certain point in history, Jesus' life they're talking about, not only happened at a certain point in history, but continues to happen, spilling out into the lives of those who receive him, and then continues to spill out all over the place. Christ is, among much else, the revelation that God cannot be contained or hoarded. It is this spilling out quality of Christ's life that accounts for the happiness of Christians. For joy is life in excess, the overflow of what cannot be contained in any one person. And that's why, so sometimes in my life, mostly in, like, as I was making my first rounds in the hospital or something and getting acquainted with the patients I was assigned to that day, it was not unusual to have somebody say, "You just seem so happy." Or I remember one day in Scottsdale where the man said, "Are you a religious?" And I thought, "A religious? Oh my, he thinks I'm a nun." And I thought, do I look that funky? But I think that sometimes the joy of being a Christian ought to spill out. And sometimes when it does, that's one of the highest compliments, when somebody just notices something about you and that spills out.
So in my reading of Philippians chapter 1 and 2, 2 points that came to my mind that I either had never learned or had never considered. One was that if you go back to Acts chapter 16, starting in verse 8, it's titled Paul's Vision of the Man of Macedonia, was actually his vision that prompted him to go to the church in Philippi. I had never connected those two together until now, so that was kind of cool. And the second thing that I learned was when we get into chapter 2, starting with verse 6, which when you read that, it'll come back to mind. It starts with, "Who being in very nature God did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, But that whole portion there, verses 6 through 11, they in the commentary that I read suggested that Paul either put those words to an existing hymn or he wrote that hymn himself. So it's actually, it is kind of poetic, but you can kind of sense that maybe it could be put to music. And that whole thing talks about humility. And I can hardly read that without imagining Jesus washing the disciples' feet. What an act of humility that was. And as Pastor Sid and Lynn both mentioned, how we can really shine the light of Christ in our service and in our compassion and in our unity with those around us. So that humility really spoke to me as being one of those traits that we can be like Christ-like in our actions by helping serving others.
So I hope those thoughts and insights have been helpful as you read through chapters 1 and 2. It's interesting how the different verses speak to different ones of us, and probably reflects where we are in life and maybe what we're going through in our spiritual journey. So I hope that you find chapter 1 and 2 of Philippians encouraging, challenging, and that it helps you express your Christian faith. Next week we will be in chapter 3 and 4, and I'm under strict instruction not to take Lynn's verses, so we'll see how that works out. Just in closing, I'd like to make note that in Lent this year we will be sending out and creating packages. And this church chat will be the central place where we go through the special days of Lent. Some of them will be the Sunday scriptures, some of them will be Ash Wednesday and Maundy Thursday, Good Friday. And I hope that not only will you tune in and watch the recording and participate in the little ceremonies that we've created, but that you'll invite family members, maybe mention it to friends, and that they too can be a part of our Lent celebration. And that way we can be united in Christ. And so be on the lookout. We will put our packages together, have them here at the church, or we will bring them to you if you need that. And so we're hoping to have those available not this coming Sunday, but the following Sunday on the 14th, and in everyone's hands by Ash Wednesday the 17th. So next week, Philippians 3 and 4, and then the following week we'll be doing a little Ash Wednesday recording and service that I hope you will participate in. Have a great week, stay safe, and God bless.